If we're still around next week, we may spend a little time. Now, we're going to be talking a little bit about criticism, those who criticize the Scripture. Very little bit mentioned about it. Most people are not interested. Most people just want to know what the Bible's saying, so we'll deal with that. If you have some questions about some of the criticism, then we can also deal with that probably after class. So that's basically how we're going to deal with this class. Now, when we get to the apocalyptic section, which begins in chapter 7, then we'll probably take a little bit more time. First 6 chapters pretty much self-explanatory, except for some doctrinal errors that are taught by those in other religious bodies, and sometimes even in our own. So here we go. Daniel chapter 7, verses 1 through 7, the trip to Babylon. In the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judea, came Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, unto Jerusalem and besieged it. And the Lord gave Jehoiakim, the king of Judea, into his hand with part of the vessels of the house of God. And he carried them into the land of Shinar to the house of his God. And he brought the vessels into the treasure house of his God. And the king spake unto Ashpenaz, the master of his eunuchs, that he should bring in certain of the children of Israel, even of the seed royal of the nobles, and youths in whom were no blemish, but well favored and skillful in all wisdom, and endued with knowledge and understanding, science, and such as had ability to stand in the king's palace, that he should teach them the learning of the tongue of the Chaldeans. And the king appointed for them a daily portion of the king's dainties, meat, king's food, and of the wine which he drank, and that they should be nourished 3 years, that at the end thereof they should stand before the king. Now among these were the children of Judah, Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, Azariah. And the prince of the eunuch gave names unto them. Unto Daniel he gave the name Belshazzar, unto Hananiah, Shadrach, to Mishael, Meshach, and to Azariah, Abednego. And we'll stop right there. So here we have the trip to Babylon. You guys get stuff? Okay. All right, chapter 1, verse 1 and following, we have the Lord, in the 3rd year of Jehoiakim, this is around 605. The Lord gave unto Nebuchadnezzar Jehoiakim. Now, the name Jehoiakim means Lord raises up. I thought that was kind of ironic that God would raise up somebody whose name was raised up. The Lord gave. Here we have the sovereignty of God given at the very beginning of the book. The sovereignty of God is asserted all through the first 6 chapters, really all through the book. But chapter 1, 2, chapter 2, 37, chapter 3, 28, chapter 4, 25, chapter 5, 26, and 6, 26. 1, 2, 2, 37, 3, 28, 4, 25, 5, 26, and 6, 26 asserts the sovereignty of God. And we'll see that all through the book. Also, I want you to notice in verse 3. In verse 3, he says that Ashpenaz, the master of the eunuchs, that he should bring in certain of the children of Israel. And then look at verse 6, children of Judah. Now, we know that Israel was destroyed, the northern kingdom was destroyed 722. Something to keep in mind as we go through biblical studies. Sometimes the name Judah and the name Israel are used as synonyms for each other. That will help you in your biblical studies because here's one case. And you'll see other cases too where the name Israel may mean the name Judah and Judah alone. So keep that in mind. Now there's 2 reasons why the seed roll was taken. Number 1, to benefit the kingdom of the captors. To benefit the kingdom of the captors. You take the good men out of the former kingdom and you incorporate them into your kingdom. We do that today as companies take over other companies. They will look through the former company, and they will see who is qualified, people that they like, have the abilities and capabilities that they like, and they bring them in. So this is something that has been used over and over throughout the annals of history to benefit the kingdom of the captors. And then the second reason would be that to ensure that the defeated kingdom would not rise up again under good leadership. If the kingdom did rise up, it would not have those who were skilled in tactical measures that would help to rally the troops. Under bad leadership, they go every which way. So that's another reason, two reasons, to benefit the kingdom of the captors and to ensure that the defeated kingdom would not rise up again under good leadership. In verse 4, we notice they have no blemish. They had to look well. During ancient times, external appearance often to those of that time would reflect intellectual intel, internal intellect. So they had to look good. They could not have any blemishes. And if you look in the priesthood, there was about 50 reasons why one could not be a priest in the Levitical priesthood if it had some kind of blemish. So we see that this is something that we see in ancient times. Also that they were taught. Notice it says in verse 4, they would be skillful in all wisdom, endued with knowledge. Literally, the Hebrew says, have a knowledgeable knowledge. This is what they mean. In other words, they had to be brilliant. They had to be scholarly. They just could not be just anybody who could add 2 plus 2. They had to be smart. And as you see, for 3 years, they were going to get a crash course in the Chaldean culture. And at the end of these 3 years, they were to stand before the king. Now, the 3 years does not literally mean 3 years. Sometimes in the Bible, a year is a full year, and sometimes it's a set of a year to be partial of a year. But at the end of 3 years, which does not completely or always mean 36 months, they were to stand before the king. To stand before the king is to stand before the king in an official capacity. In other words, they just didn't stand before him. They would stand before him in a capacity in which they were desired or put into. And this is what it is. He nourished them in verse 5. In verse 5 it says, he nourished them. They nourished them to counteract any siege condition. It was a long walk from Jerusalem to Babylon. So to counteract any siege condition, and also to make friends with them. You feed someone, you start making friends with them. So there's another reason for it. Now we have the name change. First one is Daniel, God is my judge. Now names mean something in the Bible. It's important to understand that. Like I said at the very beginning, Jehoiakim, Jehovah raises up. So names mean something in the Bible. When I was young, and my mama used my whole name, I knew my name meant trouble. For some reason, my brothers had did something, and I got blamed for it. So God is my judge. His name was changed to Belteshazzar. Belteshazzar. May Baal protect his life. And this probably, some think, it's not Daniel's life, but the king's life. So may Baal protect his life. And then we have Hananiah, whose name means Jehovah is gracious. His name was changed to Shadrach, the command of Aku, which was the Babylonian moon god. Font's messed up on me on that one. Mishael, whose name meant who is he that is God, his name was changed to Meshach, who is what Aku is. And notice the question mark. The reason for the question mark is that the etymology of the word is unknown. And some seem to think that Meshach was a corruption of the name of the god Marduk, M-A-R-D-U-K, which, if you take the time to research this, you see that Marduk may have been a corruption of the god's name, Marduk, M-A-R-T-U-K, I think it is, I forget now, which is another name for the god named Baal. So you go through all that just to find out it goes back to who Baal is. And interesting too, the star of this god is the planet Jupiter. So that's it. And then we have Azariah, whose name Jehovah as help. His name is changed to Abednego or Abednego, however you want to pronounce it. Servant of Nego, which was the god of the scribes. So these are the name changes. Now the name changes were done simply to further disassociate the young men from their former lives and even from their God. So this is probably the reason for the name changes. So there we have 1 through 7, the trip to Babylon. Now, picking up quickly in verse 8, we have the food test. And Daniel purposed in his heart that he would not defile himself with the king's dainties. Some of your translations will say meat. Some of your translations will say food. Nor with the wine which he drank. Therefore he requested of the prince of the eunuchs that he might not defile himself. Now God made Daniel to find kindness and compassion in the sight of the prince of the eunuchs. And the prince of the eunuchs said unto Daniel, I fear my lord king, who hath appointed your food and your drink. For why should he see your faces worse looking than the youths that are of your own age? So would you endanger my head with the king? Then Daniel said to the steward, whom the prince of the eunuchs had appointed over Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, prove your servants, I beseech you, 10 days, and let them give us pulse to drink, or some of your translations may say vegetables, and pulse to eat, and water to drink. Then let our countenance be looked upon you, before you, the countenance of the youth that eat of the king's dainties, and you see and deal with your servants. So we have the food test here. Now, Daniel purposed in his heart not to defile himself. Now, the food here that we're talking about is food that had been offered to idols. Paul, later on, with further revelation, would not have a problem with this. But now that we don't have, young men did not have further revelation, so they refused, they purposed in their heart not to eat of food that had been offered to idols. Good lesson here. Purpose, get a real purpose in your life. No matter what the situation is that surrounds your life, get a good purpose in your life, and God will take care of you. Remember these young boys. They had just made a long trip from a besieged city, put into a foreign land, given a crash course in the culture. Their lives probably depended upon this. And yet they purposed in their heart that they would not defile themselves. They're put in a heathen environment, and yet they still remain godly. So there's a good lesson for me and you as we read about the men and women of faith who at times were under dire straits, and yet they kept their conviction no matter what the circumstances was that surrounded their life. In verse 12, we have a testing days of 10 days. Now you'll see as we study, especially in this study, we'll make mention of it later, sometimes the number 10 will mean the number 10. And other times the number will mean much more than the number 10. It will mean in apocalyptic speech, it carries the idea of completeness. So keep that in mind as we go through this. He asked for pulse or herbs and waters. The Hebrew word here for herbs or vegetables, wherever you have, anything that was grown from seeds. Anything that is grown from seeds. So they could have a melon or two in there, an apple, they could have fruit, vegetables, whatever. Anything that is grown from seed. And at the end of the 10 days, their countenance fared better. So there is, very briefly, verses 14 through 20, the food test, 8 through 14. We pick up now in verse 14, 8 through 13. In 14, he hearkened them 10 days and proved them 10 days. No, I've already read that. Verse 17, I'm sorry. Now for these 3 youths, now here we have the wisdom test on your study guide. Now for these 4 youths, God gave them knowledge and skill in all learning and wisdom, and Daniel had understanding in all visions and dreams. And at the end of the days which the king had appointed for bringing them in before Nebuchadnezzar, the king communed with them, and among them all was found none like Daniel and his 3 companions. Therefore stood they before the king, and in every matter of wisdom and understanding concerning which the king inquired of them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and enchanters that were in all his realm. And Daniel continued even unto the first year of King Cyrus. So here we have the wisdom test. Now, as we look at this, notice that the youths were given all knowledge and skill and learning and wisdom, but Daniel was given the extra. He was understanding in all visions and dreams. Notice once again, and God gave. We see God's hand active in all of this. Verse 18, at the end of days, however long it took, they stood before the king, not just to answer questions, but they stand before the king in the official capacity which they were to stand before the king in. They commune with the king. Doesn't say how long. The text just says that they stand before the king, and he answers the questions. And they weren't there just to answer questions, but to answer the questions to show that they had the ability in what the king asked them. Notice in verse 20, in everything that the king inquired of them, they answered better than anybody. And now the critics will say, well, if they were better at anybody, then when we get to chapter 2, why didn't he call them first? Notice he answered the questions better than anybody in what he asked of them. And just like anything else, when a problem or situation rises up, who do you go to? Somebody brand new, straight out of college with an education? Or do you go to the guy who's been with you for a number of years? So the critics try to have a problem here, but there is no problem. They answered 10 times better in the things that the king inquired of them. Don't miss that. And then in verse 21, and Daniel continued into the first year of King Cyrus, and the critics will say, here's another problem. They say when you get to Daniel chapter 10, Daniel received a vision in the 3rd year of Cyrus. And this text here, the critic will say that Daniel died at the end of the Babylonian captivity. That's not what it says. This text here is to show us that Daniel lived through the Babylonian captivity. And it also will prepare us for the vision of the 77s, which we will see in Daniel chapter 9, verses 24 and following. So Daniel survives Babylonian captivity. All right. Moving right along, we go to chapter 2. Like I said, today's going to be kind of quick. We'll slow down in certain areas, but today will be kind of quick. Chapter 2, and in the second, 1 through 13, the forgotten dream. And in the second year of the reign of Nebuchadnezzar dreamed a dream, and his spirit was troubled, and his sleep went from him. The king commanded all of his magicians, his enchanters, sorcerers, and Chaldeans to tell the king his dream. So they came in, they stood before the king. And the king said unto them, I have dreamed a dream, and my spirit is troubled to know the dream. Then spake the Chaldeans to the king, O king, live forever. Tell your servants your dream, and we will show you the interpretation thereof. Verse 5. The king answered and said to the Chaldean, the thing is gone from me. If you make not known unto me the dream or the interpretation thereof, you shall be cut into pieces, and your houses shall be made into dunghills. But if you show the dream and the interpretation thereof, you shall receive of me gifts and rewards and great honor. Therefore show me the dream and the interpretation. And they answered a second time, and they said, let the king tell his servants the dream, and we will show you the interpretation. The king answered and said, I know of a certainty that you would gain time, because you see the thing is gone from me. But if you make not know unto me the dream, there is but one law for you, that you have prepared lying and corrupt words to speak before me till the time be changed, and therefore tell me the dreams, and I shall know that you can show me the interpretation thereof. Verse 10, the Chaldeans answered before the king and said, there is not a man upon the earth that can show the king's matter, for as much as no king, lord, or ruler had asked such a thing of any magician or enchanter or Chaldean. And it is a rare thing that the king requires, and there is no other that can show it before the king except the gods, whose dwelling is not with the flesh. For this cause the king was angry and very furious, and commanded to destroy all the wise men of Babylon. So the decree went forth, and the wise men were to be slain, and they sought Daniel and his companions to be slain. So here we have the forgotten dream. Very quickly, this is pretty much self-explanatory. King of the world, and he's bothered by a dream. He has insomnia, can't sleep. Calls in all of his wise men, tell me the interpretation, and then they say, well, tell us what it is, king. The king will say in verse 5, it's gone from me. Now, whether or not it was gone from him, or he was telling them this to see if they could answer, tell him what the dream was, Scripture doesn't say. But we do know it's gone from me. And he says, if you can do it in verse 6, you get a reward. They ask him a second time. And then in verse 8, the king says, I know you want to gain time. I know you want to. But if you do not tell me the dream, or you tell me not the interpretation thereof, there's but, notice, one law for you. You'll be cut into pieces, and your house will be turned into a dunghill. Verses 10 and 11 is an indictment against themselves. They finally confess, no man can do this. No man can do this. Verses 12 and 13, the king is mad, and all of them are to be slain. He's getting ready to clean house, even the young men who have just been given there from Jerusalem. All right, as we go on a little further, let's pick up in verse 14, and Daniel returned to answer. Then Daniel returned answer with counsel and prudence to Arioch, the captain of the king's guard, who's gone forth to slay the men of wise men of Babylon. And he answered and said to Arioch, the king's captain, wherefore is this decree so urgent from the king? And Arioch made known the thing known to Daniel, and Daniel went in and desired of the king that he would appoint him a time, and he would show him the interpretation. So now we see Daniel is asking for an audience with the king. And he says he will give him the interpretation. Now, as we get into verse 17, then Daniel went to his house and made this thing known to his companions. I'm not going to read all the names again. That they would desire mercies of God of heaven concerning this secret, that Daniel and his companions should not perish with the rest of the wise men of Babylon. Then was the secret revealed unto Daniel into a vision of night, Then Daniel blessed the God of heavens, and Daniel answered and said, Blessed be the name of God forever and ever, for wisdom and might are his. And he changed the time and the seasons, and he removes the kings, and he sets up kings. He gives wisdom unto the wise and knowledge to them that have understanding. He reveals the deep and secret things. He knows what is, what is in the darkness, and the light dwells within him. I thank you and praise you, O you God of my fathers, who have given me wisdom and might, and has now made known unto me what we desire of you, for you have made known unto us the king's matter. Therefore Daniel went to Arioch, whom the king had appointed to destroy the wise men of Babylon. He went and said to the king, unto him, Destroy not the wise men of Babylon. Bring me in before the king, and I will show you the interpretation of the king. So here we have Daniel asking God. Now, Daniel's prayer, verses 22, 23, there's four things that we want to see about his prayer. Number one, we see the sovereignty of God asserted once again, verse 21. He changes the times and the seasons. He changes the times and the seasons. These are not under the control of chance. He changes the times and the seasons. Al Gore. Unless you guys forgot, by the year 2015, killer whales were to be swimming in the foothills of the Rockies. All the ice caps are to be melted by now, and the world is to be flooded. 3 years ago, during his climate change rant, Obama spent about $20 million buying a piece of property over there in Martha's Vineyard that's 10 feet above sea level. God is in control. Not science, not chance, not man. God is in control. And you and I need to stop looking at the news, listening to the naysayers, and getting all wore out over what the world is going to be like. God is in control. He changes the times and the seasons. He also sets up kings, and he takes down kings. Another thing to be mindful of. It is God who determines how long a nation or a culture will be an influence or not. When we read about the men and women of faith, let's just read and understand why they were faithful. That no matter what the circumstances was in their life, no matter how far they had to walk from Jerusalem to Babylon, no matter how many times they had to go into the Colosseum and face the beasts and the gladiators, God is in control. The world may say he's in charge, but you and I know who's in charge. We've got a conviction, let's stand on it. He changes the times and the season. He sets up king. Another thing that we see that I didn't mean to go on that rant, the consistency of God. The consistency of God. He gives wisdom to the wise. He is the source of wisdoms. Proverbs chapter 2, verses 6 and 7. 1 Kings 3, 9 through 12. Exodus 31 and verse 3. All of this shows us the consistency of God, giving wisdom to the wise. And then the third thing that we see is that the omniscience of God. He knows what's in the darkness. He knows the deep, dark secrets. Nothing can be hidden from him. He has knowledge which lies beyond any natural course. And then we have the fourth thing, the immutability and the reliability of God, the God of our fathers. Now, I know you've heard me say this, that we need to really pay attention to this phrase, the God of our fathers. Of course, we know here Daniel was talking about Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. I understand that. But listen to the phrase, examine it, meditate upon it. And that will let you know that we have an old God. There's nothing that's been done that he hasn't seen. There's nothing that you and I have done that he's not willing to forgive. He's old in forgiveness. He's old in victory. And he's old in his wrath against sin. And while you and I might be hard on each other, God is willing to forgive without any doubt the contrite and humble heart that comes to him. He's an old God. He's an old God for the old, and he's an old God for the young. Verses 25, your last point on your study guide, verses 25 through 35. Let's read 25 through 30. And Arioch brought Daniel before the king, and he said thus unto him, you can get here and be heavy on that I, can't you? I have found a man. Figures he'll get some points out of this one, I'm sure. Of the children of the captivity of Judah that make known to the king the interpretation. And the king answered and said unto Daniel, whose name was Belteshazzar, are you able to make known unto me the dream which I have seen and interpretation thereof? And Daniel answered and said before the king, I said, the secret which the king has demanded can neither wise men, enchanters, magicians, or soothsayers show unto the king. But there is a God in heaven that reveals secrets, and he has made known to the king Nebuchadnezzar what the dream shall be in the latter days. We'll discuss the phrase latter days later on. Your dream and the vision of your head upon your bed are these. As for you, O king, your thoughts came into your mind upon your bed, what should come to pass hereafter, and he that reveals secrets have made known to you what shall come to pass. But for me, this secret is not revealed to me for any wisdom that I have more than any living, but to the intent that the interpretation may be made known to the king, that you may know the thoughts of your heart. And let's stop right there. So Arioch brings Daniel in before the king. The king asks him questions. Can you do this? In verse 27, God's speaking through Daniel here. And notice what he says. Neither wise men, enchanters, magicians, or soothsayers can do this. Nobody can do this. Now, as you read this, just think of the thousands upon thousands of dollars that's been spent upon fortune tellers and palm readers. Those who can read the tea leaves of the cup, that can look into your hand, that can look into a crystal ball and tell your future. I'd like to go in with a cantaloupe, put it on the table and say, tell me my future. Read this. Go in there for onion. Tell them to peel the layers back. It's a true story. I came out here in 99 with FedEx. And I had a delivery. Back then, I knew of 2 houses in Fort Collins that had fortune tellers, and I was lucky to go to one of them. So I go through the door. You know, it's got all the palms and the things on the window. I go through the door. FedEx, got a package for you. She said, what is it? I said, don't you know? Sign right here. She should have known I was coming. Didn't faze her a bit. She signed it and took the package. Anyway, there's a God in heaven. I can't do it, man can't do it, but there's a God in heaven. A God in heaven that can help us. Verse 30. Notice verse 30. He says, but as for me, this secret is not revealed unto me for any wisdom that I have more in any living, but to the intent that the interpretation may be made known to the king, and that you may know the thoughts of your heart. Notice what he says. I'm going to do this because it's not because I'm smart. It's not because I have any intelligence on my own. And I would to God preachers would remember this. We have men who will beat themselves on the chest and tell God, aren't you glad you have me? It's not the individual. It's not the time and the preparation. It's not the capability. But it's God working in you. And we need to understand that. Now, that's not to say that I'm not happy to get a pat on the back every once in a while. But what I'm saying is, we need to understand that God is working through us. In Hebrews chapter 13 and verse 20, as the Hebrew writer ends his letter, he says, may the God of peace who raised up Jesus make us perfect to do his will as working in us. We are co-laborers with God. It all begins with God, and it all ends with God. And as soon as you and I get it in our heads that it's not me, it's not the time that I'm putting in, it's not all the reading, it's not all the studying and this, that, and the other. Once we understand that it's not the education, it's God working in us, we become a little bit better servants in the kingdom of heaven. And I wish to God our brethren would understand that. Verses 31 through 35, we have the image. You, O king, saw a great image, this image which was mighty, whose brightness was excellence, and before you, and the aspect thereof was terrible. As for this image, the head was fine gold, its breast and its arms of silver, its belly and thighs of brass, its legs of iron, and its feet are part iron and clay. How many toes? How many toes? Is there any mention of toes? None whatsoever. And yet we're going to find out that toes play a big part of this image. Not for us, but for others. You saw that a stone was cut out of the mountain without hands, which smote the image upon its feet, were iron and clay, and brake them in pieces. Then was iron and clay, the brass and silver and the gold broken into pieces together, and became like chaff of the summer threshing floor, and the wind carried them away, so that no place was found for them. And the stone that smote the image became a great mountain, filled the whole earth. And we'll stop right there. So he sees an image. There he is. Notice he says, the king saw a great image. He didn't see 2. He didn't see 3. He didn't see 4. He saw one image. For our purposes right now, the time of that image is from 626 BC, when Nebuchadnezzar raised up the Neo-Babylon Empire, to 31 BC, the Battle of Actium, when Rome became the worldwide power. 626 BC to 31 BC. This is the time frame of the image, and we'll talk about that later on. Notice once again, no mention of toes. Toes will be mentioned later on around verse 40, around 40. But how many? That's important as you talk about some of the religious talking about this image. Toes are an important part to the dispensationalists. No, I don't want to get into that. And the dispensationalists say the stone struck the image, and the whole image went away except for the toes. The toes will be revived in the future. And so there we have the first couple of chapters. We'll talk some about the image and the different views of the image next week. I know, like I said at the beginning of class, I know this went kind of quick, but a lot of it's self-explanatory. Certain things that were pointed out, I'm sure. But, and there's probably some things you wish I had mentioned that I didn't. But this purpose is to get to some of the apocalyptic speech. This purpose of this study is to understand some of the false error so that we can have a better knowledge of what's going on, that when we talk to others who are questioning certain things, we'll be able to give them an answer. That's our class for this time. God bless you.